This is Let the Record Show, using common sense. Now, here are your hosts, Judge Richard Weinberg and Chairman Jesse Garcia.
Welcome back to Let the Record Show with Chairman Jesse Garcia of the Republican Party. Jesse is the Vice Chair of the New York State Republican Party and also the Chair of the Suffolk County Party. With us is our good friend, esteemed colleague, co-host with Jesse, and me, Eric Levine, a noted attorney, commentator, and essayist. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. Well, you know, the great Chinese curse, gentlemen, is that we live in interesting times.
I'd rather not be cursed.
Well, good, well said. The problem is we are cursed and we are blessed. We do have a news show and a commentary show, so there's no shortage of material. And every day I wake up and I say, can't we get anything right? And I don't mean about Jesse, Eric, and me.
We're always right.
Yeah, I don't mean that. I mean, can't the world get anything right? So let me start this off by talking about Iran. I believe that President Trump, who I generally support, and clearly is the better choice over Harris for the presidency, and certainly better than Biden in his 4-year tenure of incompetence and dangerousness.
Or whoever was running the country.
And it was awful, just awful. But this Iran situation is very troubling. Let me tell you why I'm even more troubled today. I've been saying for a long time to Jesse and to Eric, you know, they're running the clock on us, that is, the Ayatollahs. They know how to play this game. They sucker us along about they're having good faith negotiations. Meanwhile, they're building up their missile capacity for long-range missiles. They're getting support and supplies, intelligence, technology, equipment from the Chinese and the Russians. They're evading the so-called sanctions, if they even exist. They have a whole network of evading sanctions even when they're imposed. They're moving to get the capacity to have nuclear weapons, and that clock is running. Then we get Tulsi Gabbard, who's the head of intelligence in the United States. Now, I've never been a supporter of Tulsi Gabbard because I think she's a neo-isolationist, and I think that's dangerous. And she should know better, having been in the military. And the problem with the job she has is she feeds all the intelligence from all the other agencies, the intelligence agencies, to the President of the United States. So she can filter and spin and present based on her worldview, which is a dangerous worldview. She just announced within the last couple of weeks that the U.S. intelligence is saying that they're not moving that quickly. It's under control. We have plenty of time. And even the Israeli intelligence has been misled and played along. So I think both the U.S. intelligence and Israeli intelligence have missed the boat a lot of times. Now, the latest news is that the Austrian and the German intelligence networks say that they're moving much quicker, more rapidly than we can anticipate. And this is a real threat. Trump cannot continue to dither. If he does that, we're going to wake up. You're going to have a nuclear-armed Iran, led by a death cult of religious fanatics. These are dangerous people. There will not be mutually assured deterrence as we had against Russia or China, even North Korea. These are dangerous, dangerous people. When they say they want to wipe the little Satan off the earth, that's Israel, and go after the big Satan, which is America, these people mean it. It's time we got serious and looked at the world realistically. Iran is a threat, and when he sends the Secretary of Homeland Security, that is, Trump sends her,
Christy Noem,
to meet with Netanyahu in Israel and say, don't attack, we're still negotiating. They're undermining the Netanyahu regime. They're the ones who have the immediate existential threat to their survival. They have no right to do this. They can't tell them what to do. Israel should do what's necessary to protect itself, because if they get the nuclear weapon, what's Trump going to say? Oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake? Eric.
Yeah, I mean, the argument's been made that there's been no more pro-Israel president in the history of the country than Donald Trump. And I would say that is absolutely 100% true of the first Trump administration. the jury's out on the second Trump administration, and the Iran negotiations are a perfect example. There really is nothing to negotiate. There really is. Supposedly, the goal is no enrichment and no centrifuges. And if you want a civilian nuclear program, then like 23 other countries around the world, the uranium will be enriched abroad and then shipped to you. And then when used, it will be shipped out. You don't get to enrich anything. The Iranians are absolutely refusing to abide by that. And what they're doing is it's the same game plan. It's exactly what they did with Obama. They just kept negotiating. And just by saying no, 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 they got more and more and more and more. And that the concern is that that's what's going on here. I mean, Trump gave the 60-day deadline. The 60 days have expired. And if the goal is indeed this red line of absolutely no enrichment, and the Iranians are saying we'll not agree to that, then what more is there to discuss? The Israelis have already destroyed all the anti-missile systems in Iran. Now is the time to attack. This is the opportunity. There's not going to be a better opportunity to attack Iran, to take out their nuclear program and to take out the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which is the spearhead of their international terrorist network, and take out some of their important infrastructure. Now is the time to do that. They don't have to put a single boot on the ground. You let the Iranian people do the rest in terms of regime change, if that's what they want. And to the point about Trump admitting the other day that he reached out to Netanyahu and told him to not attack, well, that's eerily reminiscent of what Obama did when the Israelis shared with the United States that they had a plan to attack the Iranian nuclear program out of an airbase in Azerbaijan, which borders Iran. And Obama leaked it in order to frustrate the attack. At some point, we just have to let the Israelis win. If we really want to bring peace to the region and have a pro-Western oriented Gulf and Middle East, we have to let the Israelis win. The Iranian regime cannot be allowed to survive with a nuclear program. They cannot be allowed to survive as the leading state sponsor of terrorism. The Israelis are being attacked by the Houthis. The Israelis are having a battle with Hamas. Hezbollah has been somewhat neutered, and Lebanon, thank goodness, now actually seems to have the ability to curb their military actions. But at the end of the day, the Iranians are the ones that have to be neutralized. Once you neutralize them and their ability to spread terror around the world, you take care of the Houthis, you take care of Hamas, you take care of Hezbollah, you take care of terrorist networks in Iraq and Syria that have been attacking American service members. And we're seeing the same thing now, unfortunately, in Gaza. Enough of the damn ceasefires. Let Israel win. You want to get the hostages out? Let Israel win. Even in these negotiations with the ceasefires, it's the Israeli military operations in Gaza that's the leverage to get Hamas to agree to anything. But even now that the Israelis have accepted the most recent Trump/Witkoff ceasefire agreement, Hamas has said, no, we have to make certain changes. No more changes. We have to be some really bright lines here. One line is for the Iranians, no enrichment, no centrifuges. And for Hamas, it's no Hamas may survive. It must be destroyed utterly and completely, and all the hostages have to be released. You want to stop the war in Gaza? Hamas needs to surrender, lay down their arms, and release the hostages. So the mantras in the Middle East really has to shift from all these wonderful machinations of this is my brilliant idea to the simple one of winning. Let Israel win, and everything else will flow from that.
Jesse, your thoughts?
I agree. The clock is ticking, and that Iran needs to be, its nuclear abilities need to be wiped out sooner rather than later. Obviously, I think that we could all understand, and I think even the president has spoken to this thing, that there was some confusion, but he said very clearly that there would be no civilian or military enrichment. And I know there was a question about that. I'm no foreign policy expert, but I have respect for our intelligence community. I have respect for MI6. I have respect for Mossad, which many agree could be one of the most elite of intelligence agencies in the world, and certainly probably has the most updated information in that region. I don't know if I'm going to go with the intelligence from Austria and from Germany, quite frankly, if it's separate, if it's different than that coming from the U.S. intelligence and Mossad. Obviously, something has transpired, whether it's do we go into Gaza and Iran at the same time, almost simultaneously, or within the same time period. Something on the ground has changed that has given or necessitated this pause. And I'm only surmising this because, as we discussed, except for this negotiation, and we understand, we agree that Trump is a deal maker. That's what he is in his foundation. We also agree that he does not want to go down or be viewed and look in the mirror and view himself as Obama or Biden when it comes to this Iran deal. So something must have transpired or must be transpiring on the ground here that is creating this pause. I agree, though, that this pause cannot take longer. The Iranian leadership has, basically, drawn these things out time and time after again, and has been successful in securing what they've wanted out of lesser people. This is one of those times when you almost got to trust the people in the room and to trust the people in the know that they're doing the right thing, and that sometimes things can't be discussed publicly, even though our president has his penchant for doing so. I do give him credit that instead of lying or evading, he did speak frankly about his conversation with Netanyahu and regarding an attack upon Iran. So, again, I think that there is something that is transpiring, something that's being prepared that is leading them down this path. But again, no matter what, whatever they see on the ground, whatever intelligence they're getting, whether it's from Mossad, MI6, CIA, even the Austrians and the Germans, one thing everyone must understand is this clock is ticking and that action needs to be taken, because I agree with both of you. The time to let Israel win is upon us. They have utilized whatever ceasefires that they were able to get to replenish themselves, give their military and the defense forces a rest. I'm confident that they have masterminded their game plan strategically for Iran and for Gaza. And certainly we have to understand whether they lead or whatnot. And the point of the spear, the United States is going to be right there with them. But again, it's no boots on the ground in Israel. In Iran, and it's Israel taking the Gaza and securing the Gaza and bringing an end to Hamas once and for all through their actions, through their direct actions.
So it's interesting you talk about the intelligence. Let's remember, intelligence is really imperfect, as we all know.
It is.
We miss the Indian. The Indians have the country of India has nuclear weapons. We miss that. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. We miss that. North Korea has nuclear weapons. We miss that. Iran's nuclear program was disclosed to us not by intelligence, but by an insurgent group within Iran. Syria had a nuclear program. The Israelis took out their nuclear facility. We miss that. The Iraqis and OCR had a nuclear program. We miss that. So the idea that we have to rely on our intelligence, we need intelligence, but there's no substitute for human intelligence. And there's a place for spy satellites and all that kind of stuff, but there's no substitute for the human intelligence. But how many times do we have to miss nuclear programs from enemy nations before we finally realize that we have to err on the side of taking them out earlier rather than later? And Iran is the best example of all of them, because unlike India, unlike Pakistan, unlike North Korea, unlike Syria, unlike Iraq, which are all evil, the Indians are in their own category. They're an ally of the United States. But the others are arguably enemies of the United States. Iran is a sworn enemy of the United States. Iran has been murdering Americans ever since they came into power, this regime in 1979. This regime cannot have a nuclear program. We can't risk that we've missed something. And the only way to make sure that we haven't missed anything is to obliterate the entire nuclear infrastructure. Because otherwise, you can't have any enrichment. This is the reason why it's important for people to understand why they can't have any enrichment. Because if you have even a modicum of enrichment, it's very easy to upgrade it from civilian to a military capability. And all they would do is bide time. We have to understand that different parts of the world have different concepts of time. In the United States and America, we think only in the moment and maybe a year or two down the road. Or when it comes to budgets, a 10-year, what does it tell us? Let's price this thing for 10 years. In places like Persia, Iran, and the Middle East, they gauge time by centuries, by millennia. So if they can save their enrichment program for now, all they have to do is wait out this administration.
Yeah, they get another Obama or Biden.
You get another Obama or Biden, or you get a neo-isolationist Republican.
Yeah, like a Vance.
Who doesn't care ultimately if Iran has a nuclear weapon, and then they just ratchet it all up, and they're pretty comfortable, and with good reason, to believe no one's going to do anything. This is the moment. We need to seize it. We need to destroy Iran's nuclear capability, and hopefully the regime with it.
All right, let me switch gears. We have a few minutes left in this first segment. I want to talk to you about what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. And this is another, respectfully, mistake by the Trump administration. You have that famous discussion in the White House where Vance goes after Zelensky. All that did was embolden Putin. They held back on armaments for Ukraine. They held back on intelligence from Ukraine. And Russia took advantage of that and seized more Ukrainian territory. Let us remember who is the victim here. The victim of Russian aggression is the Ukraine. Ukraine did not start this war. This war was started by Putin's Russia. They have to be stopped. If they're not stopped, then the Baltics are next. Poland is next. NATO is going to have to come up to the challenge, and I don't think they're ready for the challenge. This is serious business. The common phenomena, whether you're talking about Iran or you're talking about Russia, is you do not embolden, you do not appease, you do not set red lines and then walk away from them when you're dealing with tyrants who have hegemonic ambitions. One hegemonic ambition, the Iranians, is to have Islamicism all across the world, not just in Iran, not just in the Middle East, but in Europe and the United States.
They're in South America. They're in Venezuela. They're in Cuba.
Look,
they're on our border. They're
what
here.
These people want is a Sharia-dominated culture. The only religion is their religion. The only culture is theirs. The only law is theirs. They tell you that. It's in their religious texts. It's in their political documents. They tell you directly when they said to the world after the first attack against Israel on October 7th, with the terrorists were funded and supported and financed by Iran, they told you they'll keep coming back and back and back. And the fact of the matter is, that's what you're fighting. And when Putin, who has an obsession about restoring Russian domination of Eastern Europe, he means it too. Everybody says, well, Trump says, well, I know the man, he wants peace. We have to find a grounds for having peace. No, the man doesn't want peace. If he wanted peace, he wouldn't have gobbled up pieces of Ukraine.
Well, he wants it on his terms.
Right, of course. Peace meaning he dominates Ukraine. Obama fell for that nonsense. Biden fell for that nonsense. Trump should not fall for that nonsense. It's nice to have a deal, but no deal is better than a bad deal. And a bad deal is one which emboldens and encourages aggression by people of bad faith. The Iranians are people of bad faith when they're led by the Ayatollahs, and the Russians are people of bad faith when they're controlled and dominated by Putin. This is Let the Record Show with Chairman Jesse Garcia of the Republican Party and noted commentator and essayist Eric Levine. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. We'll be back in about a few moments for more interesting and important conversation.
Let the Record Show is on the air.
This National Foster Care Month, Marine Toys for Tots is providing hope to children who need it most. Staff Sergeant James Caldwell, who grew up in foster care himself, shares that while handing out gifts at a Toys for Tots distribution event, a little girl looked up at him, reached into her bag, pulled out a stuffed animal and said, "Someone needs to make sure you get a toy too." That simple gesture embodies the heart of Marine Toys for Tots, ensuring every child, including those in foster care, experiences the kindness that can transform their future. Visit toysfortots.org today.
This is Let the Record Show, using common sense. Now, here are your hosts, Judge Richard Weinberg and Chairman Jesse Garcia.
Welcome back to Let the Record Show with Chairman Jesse Garcia of the Republican Party. Jesse is the Vice Chair of the New York State Republican Party and the County Chair of the Suffolk Republican Party. With us is our good friend, co-host, noted attorney, commentator, and essayist Eric Levine. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. This is today's second segment. In the third segment, we're going to have a great constitutional law professor, playwright, historian, Professor Robert Blecker, taught for over 40 years in the New York Law School, an expert on the Constitution, both historically and in current terms. And we'll be having him for our final segment of today's show. Right now, gentlemen, I want to raise this issue on a case that literally just came down from the United States Court of International Trade. It used to be known as the United States Customs Court. It's a federal court that has nationwide jurisdiction.
It's an Article III court.
Right. So unlike the U.S. District Court judges who are assigned to a particular geographic district and have territorial role with respect to those districts, but who have been using nationwide injunctions by lawfare against the Trump administration, these folks, these judges in the International Court, the Court of International Trade, do have nationwide jurisdiction. And they just came down with a decision that pretty much sets aside the whole tariff gambit of President Trump. Now, there are interesting questions about Trump and his tariff program. I'm not an insider to Trump, nor am I an insider in the White House. If it had been up to me, I would have had more targeted and limited tariffs. Tariff policy, I believe, constitutionally comes out of Congress and not out of the White House, except under very limited emergency circumstances.
Well, that formed a significant basis for the court's decision.
Right. And I also believe, frankly, in terms of the economics, I think these tariff costs, I don't think are revenue makers for the United States. People argue about that. But certainly tariff costs are passed down to ultimate consumers. That would be us, the American people, and that's inflationary. So I'm not a big fan of tariffs. And they had this case, and they came down and they said, you have to stop for now. And there's a appeal from the Court of International Trade to the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. And we'll see what happens. Trump, I think, is trying to get it directly into the Supreme Court. That's what I've been reading. Whether he's successful in avoiding the D.C. Circuit, I don't know. He's trying to get it into the Supreme Court. But the fact of the matter is, this has caused havoc in the White House because a large number of the deals that were made or in the making, relationships between friends and foes alike using tariffs as leverage, are now impeded. So this is serious geopolitical business. Eric, your thoughts?
Yeah, so the court was ruling on whether or not the Trump administration had authority under IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Power Act of 1977, which gives the president powers in the event of an international emergency to suspend certain rules and implement certain policies, and in this case, dealing with the tariffs. The Trump position was that the imbalance in the trade imbalances created a national crisis and warranted their use of the implementation of IEPA and imposing the tariffs. So the court, as you correctly pointed out, was dealing with the issue of the constitutional issue of who has the power to control tariffs. And the Constitution clearly provides that the legislation concerning tariffs is supposed to emanate and come out of Congress. And there's a concern by the court that by the Trump administration unilaterally implementing all these tariffs at these extraordinary rates, 145% at one point for China, although who I think should be in a different category than the rest of the world, whether or not this was an abdication by Congress or an unconstitutional delegation by Congress of its powers to the executive branch. And the court was referring to it as, quote unquote, unbounded tariff power. And they concluded that that was an unconstitutional use of executive power. So putting aside the question of whether or not the tariffs are wise, whether it's good economic policy or not good economic policy, one of the questions that the court was grappling with was, is there indeed a national crisis? Because the concept being that this is a crisis that recently was created, that it just happened, and now we've got to deal with it on an emergent basis. But the tariff issue has been something that's been out there for decades, as the court points out, so that it isn't something that would necessarily trigger IEEPA. Now there are other pieces of legislation that the executive branch could possibly base its tariff policies on, but it chose IEEPA. And I'm not sure that the court is necessarily wrong on its application here. It's certainly going to throw the Trump tariff policy or gamut into a cocked hat. God knows how it's going to play out. Now, originally when it was announced, I was reading that the futures market was just going crazy. It was up 1.5%, 2% S&P or the Dow Jones. But I'm looking at the market today. So this is Thursday, May 29th at 2:58 p.m. and I'm looking at the market. The S&P is up 10 points. The Dow Jones up 38 points. It's a big yawn. So I'm not sure how it impacts this, but the court may be doing Trump a huge favor by telling him that he can't use these tariffs, because I agree with Richard. I'm not a big fan of the tariff strategy. It may actually save Trump from himself in this respect, but I understand. And it's also important to note, Richard, this is a 3-judge panel, not a single district court.
That's correct. So
you have 3 judges, and it's my understanding, I have to look at the judges who are on it, but it's my understanding that they're both Democratic and Republican appointed judges that were sat on the panel. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, but if it goes in the ordinary course from the Court of International Trade to the Circuit Court in D.C. to the Supreme Court, it could be years before this thing is finally decided, unless the appellate court issues some sort of injunction against the implementation of the lower court's decision. But this will be very interesting to watch and to see how the Trump administration deals with this.
Jesse, your thoughts?
Yeah, like most people, I think most Americans, I don't think anybody has ever heard of the U.S. Court of International Trade until Thursday when this decision came out.
I thought you talked about it over dinner.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought when you guys weren't talking about the Yankees versus the Mets or the Mets versus the Yankees, this is what you talked about.
Well, listen, we do know that there should be a tariff on the New York Mets, but other than that,
they do. They have the tax.
That's true.
They have the luxury tax.
Yeah. The luxury tax. It just seems. I think that, and I'm a layman. You two are esteemed members of the bar and learned lawyers, but as a layman, I don't understand how you cannot see that this is not an emergency. We have always said that an economic emergency within our borders, it makes it into a national security issue. When it comes to fentanyl, no one can argue that fentanyl and the crisis that's coming through our borders and through countries that are doing trade with us and also poisoning our kids and our families and laying bodies in all our neighborhoods is not a national crisis. But again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a layman that sees this and deals with the results of bad policies under Biden and Obama and also our Albany Democrat progressives on a regular basis. But I also realize what the tool. Listen, as a political leader and a chairman, I know what the courts are for political adversaries like Democrats and like-minded allies of theirs, or a group that may be impacted negatively by decisions made by the executive, the Trump administration. The courts are simply, they're platforms and venues and tools for political and media purposes. In this case, there are some significant ramifications. It does take away a number of tools that, depending on who you speak to, has been working slowly, has not been working, maybe, as Eric said, saves Trump from himself. But for the courts, for one branch of government to stifle that and say it's not a crisis, the crisis did not occur in the months between January 20th of 2025 and Liberation Day, which was April 2nd, the crisis was here under 4 years of the Biden administration. And honestly, a crisis that was allowed to fester through bad trade deals that the United States had engaged in over several presidencies, over several years. This has been a crisis that has been growing. And I give kudos to President Trump because he called it what it is. It's an economic crisis that creates a national security crisis. And when it comes to fentanyl, this is a device and a drug that's killing our kids, killing our families, and leaving dead bodies in our streets. If that's not the definition of a national crisis or an emergency situation, then I don't know what is.
That's, Jesse, I have to tell you something. I think that analysis that you just gave is spot on, because if the argument is going to be that it's a crisis because of the national security impact and that the Court of International Trade was reading it too literally in terms of just pure economic financial, I think you have a very interesting argument there, because it raises the geopolitical question, Jesse and Eric. What leverage does the United States have against China and against Mexico for bringing this poison in to our country and letting the cartels run rampant? So I think that's a very interesting analysis, Jesse. You may not be the lawyer in this three-way conversation, but I think you're spot on with your analysis.
Well, I'd agree that the fentanyl is a crisis, but then the question is constitutionally, is the tariffs, the implementation of the tariffs under IEEPA, the appropriate remedy? The court would say, go to Congress, get whatever authority you need to implement tariffs and have at it. The fentanyl is a slightly different issue. It clearly is a national crisis, but is the only way to deal with it is through tariffs. I think the court's question would be, you have the military at your disposal, you have you have foreign aid at your disposal, you have all kinds of options. It's the fact that the Constitution provides that tariffs are within the purview of Congress. That's what throws the spanner in the works, and I think to a bit undermines the argument. Because there are other ways that the executive has all kinds of powers on a foreign policy basis that are vested in the executive as opposed to the legislative branch. So I think that would really kind of be the argument, because we have to be very fearful. Let's assume after Trump's 4 years, a progressive Democrat wins and becomes president. All of a sudden they declare under IEEPA, we have a climate crisis.
Well, that's always a problem, isn't it?
So we have to be careful what we wish for. Because we may get it, and then all of a sudden,
gentlemen, we did have it. We did have it under the executive orders under President Biden.
Yeah, but he didn't do it under IEEPA. He got most of this stuff was passed by Congress.
His executive powers to do that. Whatever system he may have used, those systems are still going to be available to whatever president follows. And God forbid it is a progressive president, but those are the tools there. You mentioned that there are different options for a president to utilize: military, diplomatic, foreign aid. I think that this country is kind of war tired after almost 30 years of the fight on terror. Having our boys and girls over in foreign lands like Iraq and Afghanistan, and then of course we saw a disastrous pullout under a Democratic administration in Afghanistan that we have nothing to show for. I think you cannot take any tool away from the president in trying to address an emergency. An emergency is an emergency is an emergency. And one way or another, it's got to be used. To come out and say that you have tools like foreign aid, which is being litigated in the courts now, or military, I don't know if it's right. I think it's actually proper for President Trump to utilize different tools, economic tools, against his adversaries.
Even if it's unconstitutional? Even if it's unconstitutional?
Well, but
I don't think they're unconstitutional.
Well, that begs the question. What does it mean? Jesse's onto something. What does it mean that's unconstitutional? How narrowly do you want to read this grant of thought? Jesse,
how many times have we?
Jesse, I'm with you on this. I'm with you on this.
We will see.
I'm not for the Yankees versus the Mets, Jesse, but on this one, I'm with you. I promise you that. Well,
I'm not sure where I come out on it. It's an interesting question.
Listen,
I just think that the fact that the Constitution specifically addresses the issue of tariffs being a congressional power, that's what complicates this.
No, listen, it's very, very complicated, but let me remind you of my favorite line from my favorite Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson. The United States Constitution is not a suicide pact. And fundamentally, Jesse's analysis and Jesse's argument, which I agree with, is you cannot limit the powers of the presidency in such a way that we're blindsided and hamstrung and tied up with fighting existential threats. Let's get real. China is an existential threat dedicated to our destruction. They've been using fentanyl. I think sometimes you have to read the constitutional interpretations, as people have called it, as a living document, the living American Constitution, and we need to let Trump do what he has to do on this. Where my brief against Trump is I think he should have targeted it more and not go all full out against the whole world. I wouldn't have gone against Canada. I wouldn't have gone against
in large part may have been what created an issue for the court, because it was so broad.
So we all agree. Gentlemen, I say to you, if Trump had made this targeted and limited
to China, I think it would be a different result.
And then Jesse,
here's my also issue. We're just on tariffs, and I understand I'm not a big tariff guy too. I mean, I'm a capitalist and such, but I do think that what's right is right and what's fair is fair. If a country charges us 10% tariffs, we should charge them 10% tariffs. I believe in the fact of reciprocal tariffs, and I do believe that we should have access to markets. We can't have allies or foes close markets to us or make it impossible for us to access those markets through regulation and such. That's not fair either. You're either a fair partner, a fair ally, or you're going to be a foe. I mean, everything should be reciprocal, especially with our allies, especially because there's a common ground, there's a common ideology, there's a common goal there.
Well, Jesse, as far as I'm concerned, being the only former judge in this panel, I rule in your favor. I think Eric may
Thank
appeal.
God it's former. Thank God it's former.
So
that's why it's former.
That's right. They ripped my epaulets off and threw me into the desert without a canteen. So, gentlemen, we're going to be taking a break. We're going to have a distinguished guest joining us in about a few minutes. It's Professor Robert Blecker, a great constitutional professor, constitutional historian, playwright, writer, a man who truly understands the implications of what the Founding Fathers did and how it relates to today's world. Please stay with us for a very important and interesting conversation with Professor Robert Blecker, who will be joining us in but a few moments. Stay tuned to Let the Record Show.
Let the Record Show is on the air. This is Let the Record Show, using common sense. Now, here are your hosts, Judge Richard Weinberg and Chairman Jesse Garcia.
Welcome back to Let the Record Show with Chairman Jesse Garcia of the Republican Party, noted commentator and essayist, attorney Eric Levine. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. Joining us now is Professor Robert Blecker, a very distinguished professor of constitutional law, constitutional history at New York Law School for over 40 years, a playwright, an author, and one smart guy, as John Cassavetes would say. And Professor Blecker, welcome to Let the Record Show. All of us are delighted to have you on the show with us.
Delighted to be here.
Now, I want to focus on a couple things with you. One, I know you have a new play coming out. It's called Father Anonymous. It's the story of Dr. Joseph Warren, an American hero who gave his life in a battle to America, a free and independent nation, an ally and friend of Samuel Adams and John Hancock and Paul Revere. And I want you to talk about the play and what's so important about that play. What lessons are we learning? What are you trying to say? And since you're a constitutional scholar, I want you to focus on about the problems that we seem to have every day with this fight between Trump and the federal district court judges with their national injunctions about the appropriate balance between executive, legislative, and judicial power and what prerogatives the executive has. So, Professor Blecker, You're the witness. Tell me, why is it so important that people know about what happened 250 years ago? And why is this play of yours, Father Anonymous, which is going to be at the AMT Theater, going to be such an important play?
Well, America needs a hero now more than ever, and we need to embrace our heroes. Growing up, I was taught to scoff at the idea that some people with power would use it selflessly for the public good, and that they might really sacrifice themselves for generations to come, and that they might feel an obligation and a duty for those who had made sacrifices in the past. And we had a hero, Joseph Warren, Dr. Joseph Warren, and we forgot him. Almost nobody remembers who Joseph was. We all know Paul Revere and his famous ride. It was Joseph who sent him on that ride. It was Joseph who stayed back to run the American Revolution for the first 2 months. Sam Adams had chosen Joseph to lead America. He was supposed to play the role that George Washington ended up playing, and he did, as you say, sacrifice himself at Bunker Hill. But the play, while it may end that way, is very much about a leader attempting to keep his balance, a leader who's on the high wire with no net below him and struggling to remain both principled and effective at the same time while he plays the lead role on the world stage. And of course, you've been talking about tariffs, as you mentioned, in today's decision, and it played a huge role in the American Revolution, about which we should be genuinely proud. The Stamp Act crisis of 1765 was about the right of the legislature to tax us if we weren't represented in the legislature. And we resisted the Stamp Act effectively, and they revoked it. But at the same time, we had conceded that they could regulate trade, that the British could regulate trade for the good of the empire. So they cynically said, okay, we won't tax you. Instead, what we'll do is we'll raise tariffs. And ostensibly, it was for the regulation of trade, but really what it was a tax by another name. Now, this takes us all the way back to the Magna Carta, because what's remarkable about the American Revolution, among other things, it was very unlike the French or Russian Revolution, where they broke free from a regime that they detested and wanted to make a complete break. We were fighting for the Constitution. We wanted a continuation. We just wanted to be dealt in. And the basic principles of that unwritten British Constitution, which became our written Constitution, are found in some leading documents, which we as Americans embraced and continue to embrace today. And those are the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights. Well, one of those principles, possibly the key principle of the Magna Carta, is that taxes shall not be raised unless and only if by the free gift of the commons, that is, by the people's representatives. So, on the one hand, the challenge to Trump and the administration's use of tariffs takes us all the way back to 1215 and all the way back to 250 years ago, where the question becomes, are tariffs being used as an end run around the legislature? And you could argue yes. But on the other hand, the invocation of the current administration of executive power and executive prerogative is also at the heart of the American constitutional history and at the heart of the revolution. And by the way, very much at the heart of this play, because Joseph Warren, Dr. Joseph Warren, struggles with how effectively to A, exercise executive prerogative, and B, whether and when to declare an emergency. Because John Locke, who was the patron saint of the American Revolution, knew both the danger and the necessity for executive prerogative in an emergency, as long as it was exercised for the good of the whole. Now, the current administration has invoked several emergencies: emergency at the border, an energy emergency. And so the question becomes, and by the way, this takes us all the way back even beyond 250 years ago to the 17th century, when the king claims an emergency and Parliament says there is none, you're mistaken, or even worse, you're lying. The question then becomes, who decides, the executive or the legislature, as to when there is an emergency, so that the executive has the right to go outside the ordinary rules for the good of the whole, as John Locke would say, and later to be confirmed by the whole. So the very things that are at play right now in the balance of power between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary were very much at play 250 years ago at the dawn of the revolution, and are very much at play in the play as we watch Joseph Warren struggle with the limits on his own power. When the revolution breaks out, he is in control. There's nobody else. Congress is meeting down in Philadelphia, so Sam Adams is gone, and Hancock is gone, and it falls to Joseph to be the leader. And he's trying to remain principled, and there's a young character who tries to keep him principled, and then Sam Adams is all about the ends justifying the means. And so the same drama that's being played out now was being played out then. But what really impels this play, again, is at a time in which the nation is so divided, and we need heroes. We shouldn't run away from them. Yes, they had flaws, and Joseph had flaws, but too long we've been taught that we shouldn't really celebrate heroism because there is no such thing, but there is. And if we really get in touch with our deepest constitutional principles, then I think we'll realize that it transcends the current divide, the current political divide, because what we have in common, this essential constitutional commitment, is so much more important than the current policies that divide us. And you could list 5 or 6 of them. Anyway, I've gone on longer than you probably want.
I think that was wonderful because it follows from the discussion that Jesse and Eric and I were having before. I often say that my favorite justice of the Supreme Court was Justice Robert Jackson, who said the United States Constitution is not a suicide pact. And so I'm very concerned about the threats to the United States of America from what the three of us, that is Jesse, Eric, and I, always talk about, this axis of evil that we're facing. We're facing a crisis that I think is probably the biggest crisis in the history of America. But your thoughts are very interesting. And you talk about Warren's view, which is the obligation of the people living today to honor the sacrifices of our ancestors, our forebears, the founders, by transmitting to the future generations, what they call the millions yet unborn, a constitutional republic that offers security while protecting and promoting liberty. I mean, these are important questions. When I was at New York University Law School, the Chief Justice of England, Widgery, came in, and he made the point that you cannot have liberty without security. You cannot have liberty without security, without order. And that always rang true with me all these decades and decades later. Eric, questions for the professor?
Yeah, so Professor, thank you. What do you think the Founding Fathers would view, how they would view the Trump use of the tariffs around the world under IEEPA, under the claim that there's a national emergency, notwithstanding that the Constitution provides that the issue of tariffs should be decided by the Congress?
Well, I mean, the question is a fair one. I'm intentionally, throughout the discussions that I'm having in the play itself, avoiding taking sides with the current or against the current administration, but rather linking the issues to the essential constitutional principles involved. This didn't originate with the Trump administration. The Congress ceded power that it arguably the founders would not have had it cede when it in fact enacted the legislation allowing the executive to invoke emergency powers, and he's not the first one to do it at all. Now, he's doing it vigorously, unquestionably, and if you look at American constitutional history, you'll see there, and you can go back to the British constitutional history, you'll see that we oscillate between a strong executive who's invoking prerogative and using it in a muscular way, and a strong legislature with dominant leaders. But one of the things I would say to you in terms of the invocation of executive prerogative and the adjunct of, for example, the claim by the Trump administration of a unitary executive and that he has the right to fire all federal officials, executive officials, James Madison, who was the father of the Constitution and was at this time effectively Speaker of the House, when this issue came up right at the birth of the new nation as to whether the executive had the right to fire all executive officials in the government, although he was the leader of the legislative branch in the House, nevertheless made strong and persuasive arguments that, in fact, the executive does have that power. And the remedy at the time was either the loss of confidence of the people if he fired the wrong people in the executive branch, so he wouldn't be reelected. Remember, there was no term limits. It wasn't a 2-term limit, so he would be trying to run for a 3rd term, the assumption was, and also impeachment and removal. But we've come to see in the modern era that those are not vigorous remedies capable of being exercised, especially with a barely divided Congress. But so I don't really if there is blame to be had, if anybody is uncomfortable, and everyone should be uncomfortable, let me say this clearly, though. Executive prerogative is both necessary and dangerous. It is as necessary as it is dangerous.
Well, I mean, to your point, I mean, Lincoln, of course, suspended the writ of habeas corpus.
Yep.
Arguably, there's nothing more important than the writ of habeas corpus, but it was a state of emergency during the Civil War. FDR created internment camps, not just for Japanese, but for Italian Americans. So,
yes, and we look back sometimes and we say that it was not a legitimate exercise of prerogative, whether or not it was well-meaning. But, the rest of that argument, which tends to be forgotten, Locke's statement about prerogative is the right to go outside the rules, even against them sometimes, in an emergency for the good of the whole, later to be confirmed by the whole. That's the part that's generally forgotten. That is to say, when the executive declares an emergency and exercises prerogative, often the executive at that moment, if it is a true emergency, cannot release to the public the basis for that declaration because it might involve sensitive state secrets. But the doctrine presupposes that after the emergency passes, there will be an investigation and a dispassionate look at the reasons why the executive found there to be an emergency, declared it, and the action the executive took. What's happening, and again, I'm not blaming the current administration. They didn't start this. The last several administrations, and as you point out, you can go back to Roosevelt, and Congress ceded that power more than I think the founders would have had them do. But something else to be observed. It's funny because emergencies, the Lockean notion of an emergency is that it passes, not that it's sustained year after year after year. But as you know, we have a recent history of emergencies which are declared and then remain in effect year after year after year after year, where executives of both parties naturally then try to extend their prerogative power on the grounds that the emergency continues even when it doesn't. This could take us all the way back to a very famous constitutional case, English case in the 17th century called the ship's money case, but I won't bore your audience with that.
Well, listen, I have to wind this up. This has been an absolutely wonderful discussion. It's such a wonderful discussion. We're going to invite you back. The name of the play is Father Anonymous. It's at the Off-Broadway Theater, the AMT Theater in New York City. It runs from June 13th to July 2nd. It portrays the dramatic story of Dr. Joseph Warren, an unsung hero of the American Revolution and many of his famous friends, lessons to be learned about leadership and the problems and challenges that exist both then and today. This has been Let the Record Show. We want to thank Professor Blecker for joining us. On behalf of Jesse Garcia, Eric Levine, and myself, I want to thank you very much for listening. God bless you. God bless your families. And, of course, God bless America. We'll talk to you again next week.
Hello, folks. Larry Kudlow here. Pay attention, because China is leading the largest anti-American alliance since World War II, one that's already dumped U.S. bonds, grabbed 43 million acres of our farmland, and is plotting to dethrone the dollar. That's why IRA and 401k savers are protecting their savings with gold. Please go to freegoldguide.com/Kudlow or just call 800-621-3908 for your free gold guide on how to protect your wealth with gold 100% tax-free.